Imagine an Athenian statesman standing up in the crowded council and arguing for some accommodation, perhaps for compromise, perhaps simply for safety, and being met not with applause or reasoned debate, but with stones. They pelt him until his blood smears the marble, until the city is emptied of moderation. That shocking image belonged to 479 BC, a broken Athens, traumatized by fire, rage, and shame. The man was Lycidas. The act was not casual brutality, but a public symptom. Greece had been humiliated, and it wanted reprisal. That is the true baseline for what comes next. The famous clean martyrdom of the 300 at Thermopylae left an image that was almost sacred, orderly, brave, simple. What followed at Plataea was anything but tidy. If Thermopylae was theater, Plataea was a butcher's shop held in daylight. If the 300 gave Greece a perfect martyr story to tell its children, the thousands who fought and died at Plataea wrote a different kind of answer, one of revenge, necessity, and moral blur. When someone today says the 300, they mean Thermopylae. But when the Greeks marched north to Plataea, they carried that memory like a blade. Herodotus tells us the story with grand gestures. Modern scholars sift his flourishes for the kernel of fact. What follows is a careful reconstruction, cinematic, close to the sources, and frank about where the sources may exaggerate. If this scratches the itch for raw, complicated history, hit like and subscribe. There's more to come. Stay with me. The story begins with Xerxes' colossal invasion. For 2 seasons, Persia had shaken the Greek world. Columns of men and horses, a king who thought the sea itself might be a highway under his control. In 480 BC, the Persians crossed and burned Athens. Thermopylae had been a strategic defeat and a moral triumph, a narrow pass where a tiny Greek force, most famously the 300 Spartiates, had bought time at the cost of their lives. That sacrifice became shorthand for the nobility of resisting empire. But nobility is not strategy, and the war did not end in neat images. After Thermopylae, Persia had the momentum to press on. Athens lay smoldering. Then Xerxes, for reasons of logistics, politics, and perhaps hubris corrected by caution, decided to withdraw most of his forces across the Hellespont. He left behind a competent and dangerous commander, Mardonius. This is worth pausing on. Modern depictions sometimes paint the Persian presence in Greece as a loose mass driven by numbers alone. The truth, as the evidence suggests, is more subtle. Mardonius was not a ceremonial viceroy. He was a seasoned Persian general, entrusted with an army that still possessed formidable cavalry, archers, and a corps of professional infantry. He could raise, garrison, and maneuver. When he stayed, his objective was not merely to maintain presence, but to make that presence painful, to ensure Greek city-states felt Persian steel every season until submission seemed the cheaper option.
Burning Athens again after Xerxes left was part of psychological warfare as much as supply denial. Greece responded, slowly at first, then with a speed that surprised many. By 479, the mood had hardened across the city-states. The spectacle of Lycidas stoning in Athens was not an isolated frenzy, but evidence of a populace that no longer trusted negotiation. Sparta, the backbone of hoplite warfare, was the natural anchor for resistance. But Sparta's strength was social and political as much as military. It relied on a small cadre of full citizens, the Spartiates, who alone bore arms in a way we'd call citizen elite. The rest of Spartan society, helots, were a servile class tied to the land. To raise an army large enough to oppose Mardonius, Sparta had to break some of its customs. Herodotus and later sources report that Spartans armed many more men than usual, and that helots were ordered into the field, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes under escort. A note on terms. A Spartiate was a full Spartan citizen, trained from youth in martial discipline. A helot was an indigenous serf, bound to the land and exploited by Spartan households. A phalanx is the dense infantry formation of hoplites, heavy infantrymen whose overlapping shields and long spears created a painful wall of bronze. The phalanx's power lay in discipline and cohesion. Its weakness lay in mobility, gaps, and terrain unsuited to close formation fighting. Keep those reservations in mind as we move into campaign logistics. Sparta's mobilization was dramatic in practice. Imagine a plain at dawn filling with figures in black cloaks and worn bronze. Men who had spent their lives on drills now mustered alongside farmers thrust into mail for the first time. Sources differ on exact numbers. Herodotus speaks in grand totals that modern historians often treat with suspicion, but enough was gathered to outnumber the Persian garrison at Plataea in infantry terms. Ancient commentators like Herodotus hint at tens of thousands. Modern reconstructions are more cautious. What matters is scale. This was no limited punitive raid. It was a national effort to assemble a force that could challenge Mardonius's cavalry and hold ground. The march north played out like a long, sweaty blade. Columns creaked through mountain passes, helots clung to baggage wagons, and Spartan officers enforced grim order. Food smelled of smoke and hard bread. Breaths came heavy in dust. The Spartans had to move fast to make use of the political moment. Athens had rekindled its fleet, and the prospect of a renewed Hellenic opposition needed consolidation. The long night marches and sudden forced strides were designed to coalesce allied contingents, Athenian hoplites, contingents from Corinth, other Boeotian forces, around Sparta's frame. Each allied contingent brought its own political pride and grievances. Commanders negotiated not just terrain, but honor. Mardonius picked his ground carefully.
Plataea was not random. It was a plain offering room for cavalry maneuvers and placement of a defensive stockade. He entrenched parts of his force behind a wooden palisade, what the sources call a stockade, secured flanks, and massed cavalry that could harry any infantry caught in the open. This was classic Persian operational art: use mobility to unbalance the rigid hoplite formations and then apply combined arms, archers to thin, cavalry to chase. The Persian cavalry was good at what it did. It had to be taken seriously. To call Persia merely an oriental horde is lazy and wrong. Mardonius's force included skilled horsemen, archers who shot in loose order, and heavy infantry that, while not hoplites in the Greek sense, could still hold a line under the right conditions. The Greeks, for their part, refused to let the cavalry make the rules. They occupied the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, which left the Persians camped on the plain below. From there, the Persians could not make free runs without exposing themselves or attempting to bait Greek descent into cavalry-swept terrain. The Greeks wanted a face-to-face fight, ideally on terms that neutralized mobility, uphill, constrained, and with shields and spears doing the job. Tension mounted with the small, crucial contacts that can decide morale. One such incident involved Mecistius, a Persian cavalry commander, whose death was a surprisingly costly moment for Persia. The account in Herodotus says Mecistius was a splendidly attired horseman, conspicuous on a white or gray horse, and that he drew particular attention, both admiration from his own side and focus from the Greeks. In a skirmish of light forces, Mecistius led a charge that caught an Athenian force temporarily exposed. Athenian archers countered. They were lighter troops but capable of hitting high-value targets at range. One arrow, an organized volley, or a lucky shot, accounts vary, and ancient narratives sometimes gild small events into turning points, struck Mecistius and he fell. The Persians, seeing one of their leading horsemen slain, faltered. The Greeks, meanwhile, saw the mortality of a commander who had seemed almost symbolic on his white horse. Morale is fragile. Images stick. Mecistius's fall mattered less for its tactical outcome than for its psychological effect. A short aside about sources. Herodotus gives us the narrative that preserves Mecistius and others as characters, sometimes flatteringly, but he is not a neutral stenographer. He worked with oral reports, biases, and a taste for drama. Modern scholars caution that such episodes could be amplified. Still, when cavalry commanders die in the light of battle, cohesion often frays. Commanders are not mere symbols. The standoff that followed was a slow war of attrition rather than a single climactic clash. For weeks, the two sides watched each other across the plain, probing, skirmishing, and trying to manipulate supply lines. Here, logistics take center stage.
The Greeks were on a slope with limited water access. The Persians had cavalry who moved fast and horses that drank deep. In the Greek mind, the obvious solution was to hold the high ground and starve the Persians into rashness. In the Persian mind, the solution was the opposite: keep the infantry safe behind fortifications and use cavalry to harass and deny Greek access to life-sustaining resources. The specific flashpoint was the Gargaphia Spring. In imagined terms, it seems petty, one spring. But in ancient warfare, one spring could win a campaign. According to the ancient narrative, Persian horses fouled and trampled local water sources, and there were stories of the Persian camp deliberately redirecting water or making springs inaccessible to Greek forces. In one particularly cruel act reported by some ancient sources, the Persians drove away or rendered the Greek access to the Gargaphia spring nearly impossible. This forced the Greeks to ration, to drink brackish water, and to see their lines grow taut with thirst. When an army's soldiers are thirsty and anxious, discipline erodes faster than armor rusts. Superstition rode next to desperation. Both sides were acutely religious in the sense that omens mattered. Before major actions, sacrifices were made and priests read signs. Herodotus, ever attentive to human psychology, records goat sacrifices and the interpretation of entrails. Whether the omens were real directives or post hoc rationalizations, they shaped decisions. A commander who believed the gods favored pause might hold his line. An allied commander who took a sacrificial reading as a sign to withdraw might find his hesitancy contagious. It's worth noting the coalition's fragility. The Greek side was not a single army. It was a composite of city-state forces, each with its own chain of command and honor culture. The Athenians were proud. The Spartans were ascetically proud. Corinthian troops had their own leadership. Such alliances can make large armies possible, but they also create fragile centers of gravity. A rumor, a shouted order, a misinterpreted omen could make one contingent bolt and leave another exposed. Coalition warfare in the ancient world required diplomacy on the march as much as tactics on the field. That fragility came to a head when the Greeks attempted a nighttime withdrawal to a more advantageous position. The plan, plausibly reconstructed from the sources, was to move away from the plain under cover of darkness, to link with other forces, and to avoid being outmaneuvered by Persian cavalry in the morning light. A night march can fix a battlefield advantage without a fight. The plan required precision. Units had to move in tight order, officers had to hold their men, and the allied commanders had to trust one another's signals. What followed was classic chaos.
Marching at night magnified the problems of mixed coalitions. Voices were confused, campfires were mistaken for enemy beacons, and units that could see their way less well simply broke rank. Some contingents set off early, others lagged. Some commanders worried about being accused of cowardice if they hesitated, others feared recrimination for needless risk. There are ancient hints that the Athenian contingent misunderstood directions or feared being cut off, and thus moved in a way that left gaps. On top of that, the Spartan notion of honor complicated the retreat. Amphiaratus, a Spartan commander whose name surfaces in the sources, is said to have refused to leave his position. Spartans had strict codes about retreat and duty. To abandon a ground without fight could be a stain worse than death. If one Spartan captain refused an order to withdraw, the whole maneuver was at risk. We must be cautious. Herodotus reports Amphiaratus's obstinacy as a moral and dramatic touch. Modern historians debate the accuracy and the motive. Some see it as a reconstruction that illustrates Spartan stubbornness. Others think it records an actual clash of command cultures. Either way, the effect was real. Parts of the Greek army moved, parts stood, and at dawn the array that was supposed to be cohesive revealed itself as mixed. Some units bunched in the plain, others clinging to slopes, the Spartans still in position but surrounded by ambiguity. For the Persians, dawn after a failed Greek night maneuver was the smell of victory. Mardonius and his staff saw what looked like a fragmented enemy. Some troops exposed in the plain, allied detachments separated by hills, command uncertain. In the mind of a capable general, an opening like that demanded immediate exploitation. Yet Mardonius had to weigh the limits of his own forces too. He had cavalry and archers, excellent for harrying and creating panic, but his heavy infantry was not organized in the same way the Greeks' hoplites were. If his cavalry could break the formation and his archers keep the hoplites from reforming, success was possible, but failure would be costly. The phalanx, when charged, could be lethal. At this stress point, the human factors dominate. A helot catching sight of a Persian standard might think only of survival, not strategy. A young Spartan, trained to accept orders and die, might feel the ancient itch to hold ground rather than retreat. An Athenian general might be terrified of being called traitor for any move that smelled of cowardice. The long-term political consequences of decisions, who gets blame, who gets glory, hover over each tactical choice. We reach the edge of daylight, with the two sides poised and the coalition in nascent panic. Men were sleepless, horses panted in the mist, officers barked. On one side, Mardonius's troops tightened their ranks, cavalry preparing to charge, archers readying volleys that could turn a formation into a patchwork of broken shields.
On the other, Greek units reformed under bleeding discipline, some already beyond recovery. What had been a psychological war, taunts, omens, stonings in Athens, the death of a Persian cavalry leader, was about to become a physical clash. The night's withdrawal had not delivered safety. It had created the conditions where decisions would become immutable actions. There is another necessary caveat here. When Herodotus and later writers provide numbers of dead, of troops gathered, or of captives taken, they often err toward drama. The ancient historian delighted in scale, and his audience expected it. Modern archaeology and comparative analysis moderate those figures. Whether the Greeks that morning numbered 5,000 Spartiates, 10,000 allied hoplites, or a larger host, the strategic reality mattered more than the exact headcount. What mattered was the moral impetus. The Greeks were rallying to avenge Thermopylae, to end Persian depredations, and to assert a new balance of power in the Aegean.
Across the plain, the stockade that Mardonius had ordered was a bitterly practical thing, a wooden barricade where some of his troops could shelter and where horsemen could retreat and be protected. It was not a citadel, but a tactical fortification, a place where infantry could anchor their line with a risky hope. If pressed, the defenders could fall back among the palisades and await relief. For the Greeks, the stockade represented both an obstacle and a prize. Take it, and you remove the Persian refuge. Fail to take it, and you risk being cut off. That the Persians had invested in such a structure said something important about their expectations. They did not plan to be simply a roving cavalry force. They expected to be engaged and to hold if necessary. The pieces were in place for a moment that would decide the campaign. But before the inevitable clash, the human stories linger in the mind. Think of the helot husband, pressed into a shield wall not by conviction, but by order, who in a white-hot second might step aside or stand firm. Think of a Spartan commander, chin set, who remembers Thermopylae and hears the unspoken accusation, "You left their memory unavenged." Think of a Persian youth astride a skittish mare, trained in cavalry maneuvers, who looks at the Greek spear points and feels a new, nameless fear. This was not glory as stories prefer to remember it. It was a coalition on frayed threads, a Persian commander gambling on cavalry and stockade, and a Greek force trying to stitch together honor and practical command. And beneath the tents and palisades lay the quiet arithmetic of thirst, the tiny cruelty of a foul spring, and the loud cruelty of public stoning in Athens, all pieces of the same moral fabric. What happened next would explode those threads. Dawn revealed the confused alignment of the Greeks and the disciplined, patient aggression of Mardonius.
It also revealed the emotional stakes, the desire to avenge the 300, to answer Lycidasan shame with blood, to turn humiliation into triumph. But revenge is an unstable motive in war. It sharpens resolve, but blurs distinction between military necessity and slaughter. As the first light sharpened spears and showed faces, officers on both sides made choices that could not be easily undone. The Persians readied volleys, cavalry cantered forward to test the flanks. The Greeks braced their shields in ranks, the hoplite phalanx a living barrier of men and bronze. Then, in the way ancient battles often hinge on a single event, a death, a shout, a misread order, the pressure would break one way or another. The next hours would answer questions about discipline, about coalition cohesion, and about whether the Spartans had, in truth, come to avenge Thermopylae, or simply to survive. But that answer belongs to the morning light and the clash it brought. For now, the army stands at a knife's edge. One misstep could turn order into rout, one heroic stand could create a legend, and one death could make a commander's name echo for centuries. The Greeks, strapped with the weight of memory and the practicalities of thirst, made their final brittle preparations. Mardonius, confident but cautious, tightened his rein. Men whispered prayers they believed in, and curses they did not. The field of Plataea waited, not yet blood-drowned, but ready to be. To be explicit, the Spartans did not turn on the 300 at Thermopylae. They answered their memory. Plataea was the moment when the collective weight of grief, shame, and strategic necessity coalesced into a single brutal resolution: to fight, to win, and to make Persia pay. That semantic correction matters, because what unfolded on that plain was not a tidy revenge play, but a grinding collective act with winners, losers, and moral stains. Dawn opened like a verdict. Mist burned off the plain and revealed the jagged silhouette of the wooden stockade where Mardonius had sheltered part of his force, the line of Persian cavalry glittering with horse harness and spear, and the tight, bronze-sleek ranks of the Greek phalanx. For a short, taut moment, the world held its breath. Men tightened their leather straps, priests whispered last invocations, and officers measured the span between hope and disaster. Mardonius made the first visible move. He had observed the Greeks' awkward sleep and the scattered dispositions left by the botched night march. His cavalry wheeled to probe. Archers slid into positions to rake any exposed formations. The Persian archers fought in loose order, skirmishing troops who could pepper an enemy with arrows while avoiding head-on contact. The effect on a hoplite line could be demoralizing. Without room to maneuver, the phalanx could be pitted against a rain of projectiles designed to break cohesion.
Herodotus describes an archery barrage that preceded the larger melee, and modern historians largely agree the Persians used long-range weapons to soften and confuse before committing to a decisive move. It was a reasonable tactic. If the archers could force a part of the Greek line to thin or shift, cavalry could ride in and exploit the gap. But the hoplites, for all their clumsiness in open country, were not without counters. Heavy shields deflected many missiles, and folded ranks could absorb shock if discipline held. Pausanias, the Spartan regent, understood this calculus. He had a reputation, and it was a reputation that cut both ways. He was a man chosen to preserve Spartan honor and to forge victory from the ragged coalition that stood under his command. On Plataea, he acted as both commander and sacrificial focal point. Sources tell us he performed rites before the battle, sacrifices to the gods, and personal vows, acts that had practical consequences. They enforced pause and built a narrative that framed the Spartan deed as both military and sacred. Whether those rites actually changed the tides of battle or merely shaped morale, they were part of the psychological architecture of hoplite warfare. A god-favor framing could steady a wavering line. When the archers' shafts began to fall, the Greeks tightened shields and formed wedges to protect their most vulnerable ranks. Then, at a moment that might have been coordinated or might have been a spontaneous eruption of Spartan momentum, the line surged. The phalanx did not simply march, it charged with the othismos, the famous but often misrepresented push, where densely packed hoplites would drive forward, shield-linked, to shove opponents back until contact became stabbing, smashing, face-to-face violence. Brief note, the othismos, Greek for push, refers to the sustained collective shove of packed hoplites, a process of force transfer that could decide battles in narrow space. The initial contact was chaotic and savage. Where Persians stood behind palisades, their formations splintered into ad hoc groups. Some tried to hold by using the stockade as shelter, some attempted to break into cavalry runs, others fought in close with spears and swords that were not matched exactly to hoplite equipment. The hoplite spear was designed to dominate frontal weight and cohesion. If the phalanx could keep a head-on fight, its advantages multiplied. Close quarters pushed men to extremes. Unarmored infantry, archers, landscapers of empire who were not drilled into the same system, found themselves at a mechanical disadvantage when the Greeks closed. The othismos did its grim work. Shield mims creaked, bronze dented bronze, and the line moved as one machine. In the crushing press that followed, casualties occurred in bewildering numbers, not because of single heroics, but because of sustained force and the inability of the defenders to form proper counterlines.
Herodotus' famous word pictures convey their point. Men fell in heaps, officers shouted, and the noise of metal on metal roofed the plain. Yet his account, vivid as it is, must be read with care. Ancient narrative loves the concentrated hero-killing that simplifies causation. Modern analysis suggests the momentum of a disciplined phalanx against irregular infantry and cavalry, dismounted or forced into tight quarters, would produce collapse with frightening rapidity. Then, the turning moment. Mardonius himself was struck down. The sources give us one main name. Aramnestos of Plataea is credited, in some accounts, with the fatal blow. Herodotus says Aramnestos, a Plataean ally to the Greeks, identified himself to the Spartan leaders and, seizing an opportunity, killed the Persian commander. Other reports attribute the death to different hands or present it as a chaotic battlefield accident. The important point, which the sources converge on, is this. Mardonius's death shattered the Persian command cohesion. When a central commander in an army structured around personal authority fell, subordinate officers hesitated, lines wavered, the cavalry that once harried now pulled back to avoid entrapment. Artabazos, a Persian satrap and capable commander, read the field and understood that the risk of remaining outweighed the risk of withdrawal. He began to wheel his units away from the intensest fighting, seeking to preserve what could be preserved. For a trained commander, that was rational. For a king's honor, and for Mardonius's soldiers, it felt like retreat and disintegration. The Persian army, deprived of its head and exposed to the push of the hoplites, folded into a rout that was, like many ancient routs, a dangerous time. Men in flight, cavalry trying to reorganize, infantry trapped against palisades and other obstacles. This is where the narrative becomes morally complicated. When the Persians attempted to take refuge in the stockade, they found their sanctuary breached. The Greeks pushed to seize it, partly to break the enemy's capacity to regroup, and partly out of the raw desire to finish the job. Athenian and allied troops, whose senses had been sharpened by years of Persian depredation and the burning of their city, were particularly ferocious in the assault. Engineers, soldiers tasked with siege work, are recorded in the ancient accounts as playing a decisive role. They used picks and levers, hacked at palisade stakes, and tore down parts of the wooden defenses. Modern reconstructions imagine scaffolds and tools, hard men working under fire, chipping away at what had seemed immovable.
When the stockade finally fell, the trapped Persians found themselves suddenly exposed and crowded into a small area with limited exits. The slaughter that followed was intense and systemic, not merely a series of duels. Volunteers of fortune who had fought for days now found themselves in an organized killing zone.
Men could not retreat. Cavalry could not deploy. The palisades' ruins redirected the flow of bodies into choke points where the hoplite advantage, weight, armor, spear, became lethal. Herodotus, ever attracted to scale, offers huge numbers for the dead. Modern historians dial those figures back, urging caution. It is safe to say the toll was large and that many Persians died as a direct consequence of being cornered. Even in victory, the psychological cost began to reveal itself. The Greeks had won a strategic triumph that likely ended Persian ambitions for Greece in the short term, but they had also committed acts that modern eyes recognize as atrocity. Men trapped under the stockade were slaughtered with a thoroughness that left little doubt about the campaign's moral extremities. It is important to stress that this was war as total between peoples who had been brutalized and feared annihilation. Vengeance and survival fused into a single motive. The historian's task is to describe and to weigh, not to excuse. Pausanias, at the end of a day soaked with blood and noise, performed an act that has become one of the story's most paradoxical images. He hosted a sumptuous meal in the Persian pavilion. Some sources say he sat and tasted Persian delights while his armies were still consolidating the field. According to Herodotus, Pausanias had Persian chefs and wine, and he celebrated the victory with a kind of grim irony. The man who had led austerity lived of victory's excess for a night. There is room for interpretive caution here. Herodotus may be offering a moral touch, implying that victory breeds decadence and that Spartan discipline corrodes into pride. Modern historians see the scene as both plausible and politically useful. Pausanias needed to accommodate the spoils, distribute them, and also present victory as proof of his competence. Yet history seldom ties neat morals. Pausanias' feast was not just symbolic, it was a political performance. Victory requires rewards and narratives. The spoils of Plataea, armor, horses, silverware, moved into Greek hands. The Athenians in particular played a strategic hand. While Sparta had been the central military engine of the land battle, Athens' naval power had already shown its value at Salamis and in campaigns thereafter. At sea, another significant operation was unfolding. Simultaneous with Plataea, the Greek fleet sailed to Mycale on the Ionian coast. This is a crucial point that must be emphasized. The land victory at Plataea and the naval engagement at Mycale were separate fights with separate commanders, though they contributed together to ending Persian hopes in Greece. Herodotus tells the dramatic tale of Greek ships burning Persian ships and then storming the Persian camp on the coast, an operation that removed Persian naval presence and freed Ionian cities from their imperial links.
Modern scholars tend to agree that while Herodotus may have simplified timing for effect, Mycale occurred in the same campaign season and had the strategic consequence of finishing Persian offensive capability in the Aegean. If Plataea smashed Persian ground forces employed against Greece, Mycale smashed Persian ability to project power by sea in that theater. Together, they made the Aegean a Greek lake. Back on the plain, the immediate aftermath of the combat spread outward in practical and moral dimensions. Wounded men required care, the dead needed burial, or, in many cases, were left where they fell, a fact that would later be remembered with anger and mourning. The Spartans and their allies collected the spoils. They also took captives. Some of the captives were used to convert into slaves, others were paraded as trophies. Again, the line between just recompense and indignity of the defeated is thin in wartime. One of the defining long-term consequences of Plataea and of the broader 479 BC campaign was the shift in political gravity across Greece. Athens, which had shown remarkable naval leadership at Salamis and practical resolve at Mycale, capitalized on the new balance. It moved quickly to organize the Delian League, a maritime alliance ostensibly formed to keep the Persian threat at bay. Over time, the league became an instrument of Athenian hegemony. That pivot from alliance to empire was not an immediate conspiratorial transformation, but a process accelerated by the military space cleared by Plataea and Mycale. As historians warn, it is a mistake to see Plataea purely as a straightforward victory for freedom. The subsequent Athenian rise included democratic innovation and naval power, but also imperial coercion. Some Greek cities welcomed Athenian protection, others found themselves subject to Athenian demands.
Pausanias's personal story after Plataea fits this narrative of paradox. He emerged as a hero, responsible for one of the war's decisive moments, only to fall into political quagmire and disgrace later. Accusations arose of hubris and of conspiring with Persia. Moral stains in victory follow men like shadows. Some accounts suggest Pausanias used his success to overreach, that he sought political advantage and thereby angered other Greek leaders and his own state. He was, by later reports, charged with treason and was arrested. The details are tangled and sources vary. What is unambiguous is the pattern. War rewards those who seize momentary advantage, but those same rewards can seed distrust, jealousies, and eventual ruin. That pattern echoes through the years. Athens' dominance, born in part of these victories, sowed resentment among former equals. The Delian League's treasury moved to Athens, tribute was extracted, and the balance of power shifted.
The moral irony is clear. The Greeks fought Persian domination in the name of autonomy, but within a generation, Greek autonomy itself would be rearranged beneath an Athenian yoke. The battlefield's immediate heroics did not guarantee moral clarity or political stability. The human cost remained with the families who returned to smoldering homesteads and gravestones. Plataea's victory could not bring back what Thermopylae had sanctified, the orderly death of the 300 that had become a cultural emblem of noble sacrifice. Instead, Plataea offered a different truth. Victory could be messy, necessary, and terrible. The Greeks had answered the burning of Athens not with ritual martyrdom, but with a decisive, often pitiless military response, whose practical effect was to end Persian designs in the Aegean for the near future. We should pause and take stock of sources again. Herodotus remains our primary narrative, an ancient reporter whose sympathies, narrative choices, and reliance on oral history color every line. Archaeology and modern military studies help correct exaggerations and give texture to the sounds and sights we invoke, distribution of weapon types and burial sites, fortification remnants, and logistical plausibility studies. When Herodotus gives numbers, hundreds of thousands, enormous tallies of dead, modern historians typically treat them as rhetorical gestures. The campaign at Plataea was large and decisive, but the exact totals remain subject to scholarly debate. This reflective posture does not diminish the drama. On the contrary, acknowledging uncertainty sharpens our understanding of human cost and strategic consequences. Consider the Helots. Many accounts treat them as instruments of the Spartan state, yet they were people with families and futures, forced onto battlefields that were not of their making. Some Helots fought for the promise of freedom or remission of service, others fought under compulsion. The moral calculus here is stark. A society that relied on servile labor could, in a crisis, transform its social lines into military ones, but the human consequences reverberated long after the battle horns fell silent. There is also the issue of the Persian troops' nature. It is a mistake to reduce them to faceless numbers. Mardonius had maintained a professional corps, cavalry who knew tactics, infantry who could hold formations, and archers whose skill was adapted to the plains of Asia. The Persian defeat at Plataea is not proof of some civilizational inferiority, but evidence of contextual limits. Away from their ideal conditions, on a battlefield where hoplite cohesion mattered most, their tactical advantages were neutralized. Their defeat came from a combination of leadership loss, terrain favoring the Greeks, and the phalanx's brutal effectiveness in confined frontal engagements.
As night fell after the slaughter, the field smoldered with the remains of a clash that had decided the question of Persian presence in central Greece. The allied Greeks had demonstrated the capacity to muster, unite, and fight in a way that turned the tide. Yet they had also shown the moral complexity of that fight. Vengeance was a spur, survival was a necessity, brutality followed in the wake of triumph. Those who praised the heroism of Thermopylae would have to integrate the uglier language of Plataea into their story of resistance. In the political aftermath, Athens emerged transformed. The city's leadership, fortified by naval successes and by prestige, guided the creation of the Delian League, an alliance that would offer protection for Ionian Greeks and secure sea lanes. Over the subsequent decades, the League turned into an instrument of Athenian policy. Funds that began as common defense were used to rebuild Athens with marble and to establish cultural projects that became the legacy of classical Greece. If Plataea and Mycale had liberated Ionian cities and secured the Aegean, they also inadvertently cleared the way for a shifting hegemonic order centered on Athens. And yet, Athens' golden age contained contradictions. The democracy that flourished was not a universal enfranchisement. Many in Athens were disenfranchised, and many subject cities remained under Athenian compulsion. The moral arc from collective defense to imperial control is not tidy, it is messy,
shaped by human ambition, fear, and the practical needs of security. Philosophers, playwrights, and politicians of the next generation would grapple with the moral fallout, including the costs of empire. Pausanias's fall was a cautionary subplot. A commander acclaimed in war can become suspect in peace, especially in a culture where pride and rumor traveled fast. Accusations of treachery against Pausanias, of secret dealings with Persians, of overweening ambition, led to his arrest by his fellow Spartiates. Whether those accusations were fully grounded or politically motivated remain debated. What is clear is that leadership rarely enjoys a clean ledger. Victories create opportunities, but they also invite rivals and retrospective moral accounting. History's final irony is this. Thermopylae became legend because it was simple, a tiny force, ordered death, an image easy to retell. Plataea became history because it was complex, coalition politics, logistics, accidental heroisms, and the messy grinding of an army into victory. The people who fought at Plataea carried with them the weight of Thermopylae's memory and gave a bloodier, less tidy answer. For a culture that loved both heroic narratives and practical results, Plataea was necessary, ugly, and decisive. As we look back, what should we take away?
Military history teaches us that tactics and logistics are as decisive as bravery, that command structures and cohesion matter, that small events, an arrow, a confused order, the death of a commander, can tip entire campaigns. Moral history reminds us that victory is not purity. The slaughter at Plataea removed a political threat, but also left moral questions about how triumph justifies means. Political history shows how victories open new pathways. Athens' naval dominance and the Delian League would shape the next generation, for better and for worse. Plataea's legacy is thus doubled. It is a military resolution to a strategic problem, and it is an ethical turning point for Greek civilization. The Spartans and their allies saved their homeland from direct Persian rule. They avenged the humiliation of a burned Athens and the grieving narrative of Thermopylae. But in that victory they sowed both the seeds of Athenian ascendancy and the behaviors that would, later, create division among the Greeks. To close the loop on the title, when we say it was 10,000 Spartans who avenged the 300, we are compressing a more nuanced working truth. The force at Plataea included thousands of Spartiates, many allied hoplites, and numerous helots support personnel. The impetus was collective Greek vengeance and survival. The 300 remained a symbol. Plataea was the actual instrument of strategic closure. If Herodotus is the grand storyteller who gives us vivid names and dramatic arcs, the modern historian is the careful editor who reminds us to question scale and to attend to complexity. Together they build a picture that is cinematic and sober, a landscape where heroism sits beside atrocity, where strategic necessity rubs elbows with personal glory, and where the outcomes of one battlefield echo into the politics of an entire region. There is, finally, a human aftertaste. The men who returned to their cities bore medals of victory and the silent wounds of violence. Families counted their dead, priests held rites, and poets turned deeds into song. The stones of Plataea and the memory carved into Greek life record both the necessity of defense and the ever-present shadow of revenge. In time, the story would be told and retold, each recitation polishing certain images and dimming others. Thermopylae remained the clean martyrdom. Plataea would keep the smell of blood and the awkward optics of necessity. This is history in its difficult, human form. It offers no simple moral. It gives us lessons about the brittleness of coalitions, the decisive power of logistics, the dangers of conflating honor with strategy, and the seeds of political change that follow in the wake of military victory. It asks us to hold in one mind both the Spartan courage and the grimness of massacre, both the tactical genius of Mardonius and the disaster that attended his death. If you found this unpacking of Plataea illuminating, there's a deeper thread to follow. The rise of Athens and the Delian League is the subject of our next examination, how victory at Plataea opened the door for a new kind of Greek power. Subscribe and check the playlist to follow that story. There's more to dig into about how freedom and empire braided themselves into the classical world. Plataea ended an immediate threat. It did more. It reshaped Greek politics, tested moral boundaries, and set a course whose consequences lasted generations. In the raw ledger of war, the Greeks had avenged Thermopylae. In the long ledger of history, they had also sown the divisions and ambitions that would define their age.